bourgeoisie produces, above all, art zone.
Gravediggers.
Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of Das Kriminal True Crime Podcast. Amr can't make this one for health reasons, so it's just going to be me today. We're going to continue discussing the 2011 uprising, 2013 counter-revolution, and the Sisi regime in Egypt. And then next week intend to continue our Arab uprising series with Bahrain. I do want to put a content warning on this episode. There are mentions of violence, including torture. This is a true crime podcast, but we still like to let you know when a crime is particularly gruesome. I will let you know when I'm about to describe the worst parts of this case so that listeners who may want to skip ahead can do so. We mentioned this case briefly in our last episode, but thought it was worth a deeper exploration. So today we're bringing you the kidnapping and murder of Giulio Regeni. On January 25th, 2016, exactly 5 years after the explosion of the Egyptian uprising that ousted longtime dictator Hosni Mubarak, an Italian graduate student named Giulio Regeni went missing in Cairo. 9 days later, on February 3rd, 2016, his body was discovered on the side of a highway with definite signs of torture. Regeni had been researching Egypt's independent trade unions. To this day, his murder remains officially unsolved. Now, before we even begin diving into this case, I'd like to note that thousands of people have been murdered or disappeared under the Sisi regime, most of them Egyptian nationals. In last week's episode, for instance, we discussed the arrest, torture, and later suicide of Egyptian activist Sarah Hegazi. And it is partially because of Giulio Regeni's status as an Italian national and Cambridge University student that this case has received so much international attention, while the same media outlets hardly make a peep about disappeared and tortured Egyptian citizens. We want to be reflexive in this podcast and note that of the cases we cover, many are only possible because of the reporting that has already been done. We are not investigative reporters. We can only research and comment on subjects and cases that already receive media attention. So, we want to stress that the Regeni kidnapping and murder is an outlier, and that it involves an Italian and therefore a European Union citizen, and that this has led to an international media spotlight on the case, whereas many similar crimes in Egypt are largely ignored. Additionally, lots of source material for this case was originally written in Italian. I can read in English and in Arabic without the aid of a translator, but for some of the Italian content, I use the translate function in Google Chrome. If any information is inaccurate because of that, you have my sincerest apologies, though I tried to verify all information across multiple sources and list these in the source document as we always do for the podcast. Giulio Regeni was born on January 15th, 1988, making him 28 years old at the time of his death in 2016. He grew up in a former commune known as Fiumicello in the province of Udine in northeastern Italy. Members of his community remember him as someone who was bright and politically active from a young age. Giulio earned a first-class bachelor's degree in Arabic and politics at the University of Leeds, and from there went on to earn his master's in development studies at Cambridge. After that, Giulio moved to Cairo to work for the United Nations Industrial Development Organization. He then spent about a year working for the international consulting firm Oxford Analytica. By that point, if my analysis of the timeline lines up correctly, Hosni Mubarak had already been removed from power, and Morsi had become Egypt's president or was being ousted in the 2013 coup and counter-revolution. For a more detailed analysis of that, please see our previous episode on Egypt. Regeni returned to the Center of Development Studies at the Department of Politics and International Studies at Cambridge University in 2014, this time aiming for his PhD. His obituary from the university reads, quote, "Inspired by work on how trade unions organize in pre-2011 Egypt, Giulio sought to understand how the labor sector was changing in the country, in the context of economic globalization and greater international institutional linkages." End quote. Though labor union membership in Egypt skyrocketed after the fall of the Mubarak regime, Regeni's research specifically focused on a growing solidarity movement among street vendors in Cairo. Like his academic advisor at Cambridge, Maha M. Abdulrahman, Giulio was critical of the Sisi regime and its suppression of labor movements and political dissent. He wrote articles in Italian under a pseudonym condemning Sisi's government. Giulio originally intended to return to Cambridge to finish his writing and teach in January of 2016, but, as his research was progressing well, made the decision to remain in Cairo until March of that year. As we know, Giulio would never return to his university. On the evening of January 25, 2011, Giulio Regeni was on his way to the metro in central Cairo to visit some friends. Security was heightened in the capital that day, as it was the 5-year anniversary of the start of the uprising that overthrew Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak in 2011. In the time since, Egypt had elected a new president, Mohamed Morsi, who had been overthrown in a coup by General Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, who leads the country today. According to sources uncovered by Reuters, Regeni was picked up in a police sweep by plainclothes officers and transported via a white minibus with police license plates to Izbakiya police station. That was the last time he was ever seen alive. When he didn't show up to his friend's gathering or respond to messages from his friends, family, and girlfriend, Giulio's loved ones immediately knew something was wrong. Friends began a hashtag #WhereIsGiulio, and his parents flew from Italy to Cairo to assist in any way they could with the search for their son. Some media outlets speculated that Giulio had been abducted by Islamist militants, a frightening prospect, as it wouldn't have been the first time that an extremist group kidnapped and murdered a foreign national to create a stir. In August of 2015, for instance, an ISIS affiliate known as Sinai Province snatched and beheaded Croatian topographer Tomislav Salapec. But the response by Egyptian officials to Regeni's kidnapping was strange. They showed no sense of urgency in rescuing him, as they had when Salapec had been abducted. Egypt's foreign minister, the country's minister of military production, and Sisi's own national security advisor, Faiza Abdelnega, all claimed to have no information about Giulio's disappearance. Egypt's interior minister, Magdi Abdel-Ghaffar, took 6 days to agree to meet with Italian ambassador Maurizio Massari, only to tell the diplomat that he didn't know and couldn't do anything. This was unusual for Egyptian security forces, which tend to closely surveil communities through a network of informants commonly referred to in Arabic as mukhabarat. The mukhabarat technically means intelligence, such as the Jahaz al-Mukhabarat al-Amma, or General Intelligence Directorate in Egypt. It also generally refers to spies and informants. In Middle Eastern and North African countries with a strong central security apparatus, such as Egypt or Jordan, these neighborhood spies are everywhere. When I lived in Jubayha in East Amman, for example, a local barber was chased out of town after it was discovered that he was informing security forces on his clients. In such places, you have to be careful about vocalizing dissent, as you never know who in your university lecture, hobby class, or local cafe might be on the regime's payroll. So, the fact that a central security agency with so many operatives in the city would have no clue about a missing Italian student, one who had connections to the community through his work with street vendors, struck Italian investigators as extremely odd. Certainly, someone had to know something, right? Then, on the morning of February 3rd, 2016, a bus driver noticed something on the side of the Alexandria Desert Highway in western Cairo. Upon further inspection, it was the body of Giulio Regeni, smeared with blood and naked from the waist down. Giulio's body showed clear signs of torture. I'm going to read 2 accounts, first from a New York Times Magazine article by Declan Walsh, and second from the Wikipedia page on the murder. Both are very graphic, and I would urge listeners who do not want to hear descriptions of Giulio's injuries to skip ahead about 2 minutes. However, the torture Regeni endured before his death is crucial to understanding what might have happened to him, and who might have inflicted that violence, so it is important to document. From the Declan Walsh article, quote, Regeni's mouth was agape and his hair was matted with blood. One of his front teeth was missing and several were chipped or broken, as if they had been struck with a blunt object. Cigarette burns pocked his skin, and there were a number of deep wounds on his back. His right earlobe had been sliced off, and the bones in his wrists, shoulders, and feet were shattered. A wave of nausea washed over Massari. Regeni appeared to have been extensively tortured. Days later, an Italian autopsy would confirm the extent of his injuries. Regeni had been beaten, burned, stabbed, and probably flogged on the soles of his feet over a period of 4 days. He died when his neck was snapped. End quote. And from the Wikipedia page on the crime, quote, his recovered body showed signs of extreme torture. Contusions and abrasions all over from a severe beating. Extensive bruising from kicks, punches, and assault with a stick. More than 24 bone fractures, among them several broken ribs, all fingers and toes, as well as legs, arms, and shoulder blades. Multiple stab wounds on the body, including the soles of the feet, possibly from an ice pick or an awl-like instrument. Numerous cuts over the entire body made with a sharp instrument suspected to be a razor. Extensive cigarette burns. A large burn mark between the shoulder blades made with a hard and hot object. A brain hemorrhage. And a broken cervical vertebra, which ultimately caused death. End quote. Though some initial reports allege that there was evidence someone had administered electric shocks to Regeni's genitals, a 300-page report of the Italian autopsy findings denies these claims. Italian and Egyptian forensic experts believe Giulio was interrogated and tortured for at least 4 and up to 7 days at intervals of 10 to 14 hours before his neck was broken. From the start, Egyptian authorities completely botched the Giulio Regeni kidnapping-turned-murder investigation. Whether this is due to ineptitude or Egyptian government involvement is technically unknown, though every piece of journalism I've found that doesn't come from a Sisi regime mouthpiece leans toward the latter. According to Walsh's article, quote, a team of 7 Italian investigators had arrived in Cairo to help with the Egyptian investigation. They were hindered at every turn. Witnesses appeared to have been coached. Surveillance footage from the subway station near Regeni's apartment had been deleted. Requests for metadata from millions of phone calls were refused on the grounds that it would compromise the constitutional rights of Egyptian citizens. End quote. Then, something bizarre happened. On March 24, 2016, the Cairo police opened fire on a minivan carrying 5 men, several of whom had convictions for drug-related offenses. All 5 were killed, and police issued a statement saying that the men had been part of a gang kidnapping foreigners. The police then claimed to have recovered Giulio Regeni's passport, credit card, and student identity card in an apartment linked to the men. But cracks in this story immediately began to surface. Witnesses of the events told journalists that police had executed the men in cold blood, even shooting one as he ran away and later positioning his body in the van. Cell phone records later showed that the supposed gang leader had been 60 miles north of Cairo the evening Regeni was snatched between his apartment and the metro station. The New Cairo prosecutor's office later denied that the men killed in or near the minivan were linked to Regeni's abduction. Moreover, why would this gang hold on to such clear evidence of their involvement in Regeni's disappearance, like his passport, ID, and credit card? Surely they would dispose of these things with his body or otherwise get rid of them. But either Cairo police or Egyptian security forces did indeed have possession of Regeni's passport, ID, and credit card at some point, as they handed them over to Italian prosecutors in November of 2016. More information about Regeni began to trickle out to Italian investigators and journalists. Months after Regeni's murder, Egypt's chief prosecutor finally publicly admitted that Egypt's National Security Agency had been monitoring Regeni before his death, suspecting him of espionage. As it turns out, both Regeni's contact in the street vendors union, Mohammed Abdullah, and Regeni's roommate, lawyer Mohammed al-Sayed, had served as informants for the National Security Agency. In other words, they were the mukhabarat lurking near Giulio Regeni. Giulio's other roommate, Julian Shoki, later told Declan Walsh that Regeni had once told her that he had an Israeli girlfriend and that he had visited Israel, and that she suspected he worked for Mossad. Shoki shared her thoughts with Egyptian security forces, who she alleges suspected the same thing. Shoki's story immediately seemed shady to me. First, that she would admit to spying on her roommate for a regime that anyone paying attention considers authoritarian and corrupt. And second, that the Egyptian security forces would confirm any of their suspicions to an informant. That being said, Regeni fits the profile of a spy. He was an international student embedded with the Street Vendors Union, who had previous connections to a consulting firm. But that doesn't mean he was a spy. Plenty of students, including myself and many of my friends, conduct research in a foreign city, and that doesn't make us spies. But phone records do confirm that the police officer who allegedly discovered Regeni's passport at the purported gang hideout had connections to the national security team following Regeni. Whether national security was following him because they believed him to be a spy or for some other possible reason is, of course, still unknown to the public. In the past few years, the investigation has pretty much faded from public memory. Regeni's professors and colleagues at Cambridge have shown reluctance to cooperate with authorities in the investigation, sparking more suspicions of a conspiracy and cover-up. Despite initial condemnations of the Egyptian government's failure to apprehend Giulio's murderers and possible involvement in the events, diplomatic relations between Italy and Egypt have largely returned to normal. Italy and the European Union back Sisi in his domestic war on terror, with money, weapons, and logistical support. These same resources are of course turned on Egyptian activists like Sarah Higazi for suspected rebellion against the regime. Meanwhile, Sisi just responds to accusations of human rights violations like kidnappings, torture, and extrajudicial killings with, "We're all trying to find the guy who did this," and Western governments swallow it hook, line, and sinker. So let's get into some of the theories of what happened to Giulio Regeni. The first theory is that Giulio Regeni was abducted and murdered by some sort of gang targeting foreigners. Again, I've never seen anyone seriously consider this theory except the Egyptian government itself. Why torture someone if the plan is robbery or ransom? Even gangs who kidnap people to extort ransom money won't torture and beat them to death. They might send a body part like a finger or an ear to show they're serious, but the goal is profit, not torture. Furthermore, if you kill the victim before the ransom has been paid, you've lost all the money. You also need space to torture someone for 10 to 14 hours per day for perhaps a week straight. That isn't possible in a flat in downtown Cairo, which leads me to believe this happened somewhere like maybe a warehouse or the basement of a police station. The second theory is that Giulio Regeni was abducted and killed by Egyptian security forces because he was suspected of being a spy. Whether he was a spy or not becomes another question, something like throwing the accused witch in the river, and if she drowned, she was innocent. If Regeni was a spy, then he wasn't a very good one, especially if he got local roommates who suspected him of espionage. Certainly, with the financial backing of a foreign government or international consulting firm, they could have sprung for at least a studio apartment. If he were a spy, or a suspected spy, why not simply hold him in prison or expose and deport him? What is the purpose of torturing and killing him, unless you believe he holds valuable information? The third theory is that Giulio Regeni was kidnapped and tortured by low-level officers who didn't have approval from the upper levels of the government. Declan Walsh asks, quote, "Which Egyptian official figured that torturing a foreigner was a good idea? Why dump his body on a busy highway instead of burying it in the desert where it might have never been found? And why produce his body as a high-level Italian delegation arrived in Cairo?" End quote. There's another possibility from Walsh. Quote, "Regeni had been caught in a shadowy turf war between national security and military intelligence, with one group seeking to use his death to embarrass the other." End quote. I suppose this is possible, but extremely dangerous for either group. If exposed, the Sisi regime would deal with them swiftly and painfully for the international embarrassment. Next, there's a theory that Regeni's death was a deliberate attempt to send a message to other activists and labor organizers. If the Sisi regime can abduct and murder a foreign national right under the Italian government and European Union's nose, imagine how it can violate Egyptian people who have almost no international avenue of justice. Indeed, thousands of people have disappeared under the Sisi regime. Many of these are suspected Muslim Brotherhood members, labor organizers, LGBT people, and other political dissidents. Perhaps the Sisi regime heard of Regeni's criticisms and abducted and tortured him for those. There's another theory that I haven't seen mentioned elsewhere, and I'm not claiming to be an expert, I'm just throwing out ideas, but what if Regeni's kidnapping and murder was a false flag attack? Sisi security forces kidnap an Italian student planning to frame Islamists like ISIS. Perhaps they already had some neighborhood ISIS sympathizers or suspected Muslim Brotherhood members identified through Muhabarat on whom they planned on pinning the crime. They hoped that Regeni's kidnapping and murder would generate international attention and galvanize the Italian government and European Union to send even more counterterrorism aid to Egypt, just as they had in the immediate aftermath of the kidnapping of the Croatian man Tomislav Salopec. But the security forces bungled the operation by torturing Regeni the only way they knew how, and forensics experts immediately recognized the injuries as government violence. Thus, the Egyptian government decided to abandon the frame job and instead hoped that if they bided their time, international attention would fade and the problems with Italy would eventually go away, which is precisely what happened. Of course, maybe it's a combination of these things. For instance, it was a false flag type of attack, but Regeni was chosen because he had vocalized opposition toward the Sisi government. 2 birds, 1 stone. I want to end this episode with a quote left on Giulio's Cambridge University obituary by a classmate. Quote, "Giulio, thank you for your courage, your curiosity, and the powerful gift you have left us in our memories and your work. You just have left such an incredible, inspirational path behind you. Your writing brings deep respect to the daily, exhausting, and vital work of people whose efforts are barely recognized elsewhere. To the personal relations, the everyday indignation, and stubborn perseverance in the efforts to build a better world. You documented hope, even where it is so hard to see, especially now. Not hope in the abstract sense, but a hope that takes strength and commitment. There are just so many more things to talk about, so many paths left to explore. But instead, all I can say is that all of us who knew you, and all those others who will know you in your work and in your memory, will try our best to keep struggling for that kind of just, compassionate world that you fought for. Giulio, rest in deep peace, but we will keep fighting with you." End quote. Thank you for listening, and if you like the podcast, you can subscribe to our Patreon to support financially, or just tell your friends, rate and review us on Apple Podcasts. That really helps our visibility, and keep coming back week after week for more content. We'll be back next week with Amr to discuss the Arab uprising in Bahrain, so we're really looking forward to that. Again, thank you guys so much, and sending you solidarity.